So, happy Halloween. I thought I would do a random themed video of Carl Jung's story of a haunted house. And I thought I'd do that for Halloween just to kind of get some different kind of content out there. So basically I'm just gonna read out Carl Jung's haunted house story. And so if you're following along, this actually was submitted by Jung himself to a publication called Spuk, I think is how you pronounce it. And it's basically a study of hauntings and poltergeist cases by the zoologist Fanny Moser. So you can look that up if you'd like. But this below extract is going to be from C.G. Jung's Psychology and the Occult. Okay, so you can find it in that publication if you're looking for it. So let us just read out what Jung's haunted house story. Okay, so he has a colleague who he called Dr. X. Okay, so Dr. X is someone, but we don't know who it is, but he just refers to him as Dr. X. So we'll just go with that for now. And so he's actually attending this cottage that I think Dr. X looks after, or he owns it or something like that. I'm not quite sure, but they start attending this cottage in Buckinghamshire, and it's at a ridiculously low price, apparently. But so here we go. This is Jung writing this. The first night, tired from the strenuous work of the week, I slept well. We spent the next day walking and talking. That evening, feeling rather tired, I went to bed at 11 o'clock, but did not get beyond the point of drowsing. I only fell into a kind of torpor. Now, if you don't know what torpor means, I had to look it up. It's a weird word. Torpor means a state of physical or mental inactivity or lethargy. Okay? So he was kind of really lethargic, but he was kind of just stuck in this weird state of inactivity. That evening, feeling rather tired, I went to bed at 11 o'clock, but we did not get beyond the point of drowsing. I only fell into a kind of torpor, which was unpleasant because I felt I was unable to move. Also, it seemed to me that the air had become stuffy, and that there was an indefinable, nasty smell in the room. I thought I'd forgotten to open the windows. Finally, in spite of my torpor, I was driven to light a candle. Both windows were open, and a night wind blew softly through the room, filling it with flowery scents of the high summer. There was no trace of the bad smell. I remained half awake in my peculiar condition until I glimpsed the first pale light of dawn through the east window. At this moment, the torpor dropped away from me like magic, and I fell into a deep sleep from which I awoke only towards 9 o'clock. On Sunday evening, I mentioned in passing to Dr. X that I had slept remarkably badly the night before. He recommended me to drink a bottle of beer, which I did. But when I went to bed, the same thing happened. I could not get beyond the point of drowsing. Both windows were open, the air was fresh to begin with, but after about half an hour it seemed to turn bad. It became stale and foggy, and finally somehow repulsive. It was hard to identify the smell, despite my efforts to establish its nature. The only thing that came into my head was that there was something sickly about it. I pursued this clue through all the memories of smells that a man can collect in 80 years of work at a psychiatric clinic. Suddenly, I hit on the memory of an old woman who was suffering from an open carcinoma. This was quite unmistakably the same sickly smell I had so often noticed in her room. As a psychologist, I wondered what might be the cause of this peculiar olfactory hallucination, but I was unable to discover any convincing connection between it and my present state of consciousness. I only felt very uncomfortable because my torpor seemed to paralyze me. In the end, I could not think anymore and fell into a torpid doze. Suddenly, I heard the noise of water dripping. I didn't turn off the tap properly, I thought. Of course, there's no running water in the room, so it's obviously raining, yet today was so fine. Meanwhile, the dripping went on regularly, 1 drop every 2 seconds. I imagined a little pool of water to the left of my bed near the chest of drawers. Then the roof must leak, I thought. Finally, with a heroic effort, so it seemed to me, I lit the candle and went over to the chest of drawers. There was no water on the floor, and no damp spot on the plaster ceiling. Only then did I look out of the window. It was a clear, starry night. The dripping still continued. I could make out a place on the floor about 18 inches from the chest of drawers where the sound came from. I could have touched it with my hand. All at once the dripping stopped and did not come back. Towards 3 o'clock, at the first light of dawn, I fell into a deep sleep. No, I have heard death. Watch beetles. The ticking noise they make is sharper. This was a duller sound, exactly what would be made by drops of water falling from the ceiling. I was annoyed with myself, and not exactly refreshed by this weekend, but I said nothing to Dr. X the next weekend. The next weekend, after a busy and eventful week, I did not think at all about my previous experience, yet hardly had I been in bed for half an hour than everything was there as before: the torpor, the repulsive smell, the dripping. And this time, there was something else. Something brushed along the walls. The furniture creaked now here and now there. There were rustlings in the corners. A strange restlessness was in the air. I thought it was the wind. Lit the candle and went to shut the windows, but the night was still. There was no breath of wind. So long as the light was on, the air was fresh and no noise could be heard. But the moment I blew out the candle, the torpor slowly returned, the air became foggy, and the creakings and rustlings began again. I thought I must have noises in my ear, but at 3 o'clock in the morning they stopped as promptly as before. The next evening, I tried my luck again with a bottle of beer. I had always slept well in London and could not imagine what could give me insomnia in this quiet and peaceful spot. During the night, the same phenomena were repeated, but in intensified form. The thought now occurred to me that they must be parapsychological. I knew that problems of which people are unconscious can give rise to exteriorization phenomena, because constellated unconscious contents often have a tendency to manifest themselves outwardly somehow or other. But I knew the problems of the present occupants of the house very well, and could discover nothing that could account for the exteriorizations. The next day, I asked the others how they had slept. They all said they had slept wonderfully. The third night, it was even worse. There were loud knocking noises, and I had the impression that an animal about the size of a dog was rushing around the room in a panic. As usual, the hubbub stopped abruptly with the first streak of light in the east. The phenomena grew still more intense during the following weekend. The rustling became a fearful racket, like the roaring of a storm. Sounds of knocking came also from outside in the form of dull blows, as though somebody were banging on the brick walls with a muffled hammer. Several times I had to assure myself that there was no storm and that nobody was banging on the walls from outside. The next weekend, the 4th, I cautiously suggested to my host that the house must be haunted, and that this would explain the surprisingly low rent. Naturally, he laughed at me. although he was as much at a loss as I about my insomnia. It had also struck me how quickly the two girls, whom Dr. X had engaged as housekeepers, cleared away after dinner every evening and always left the house long before sundown. By 8 o'clock there was no girl to be seen. I jokingly remarked to the girl who did the cooking that she must be afraid of us if she had herself fetched every evening by her friend and was then in such a hurry to get home. She laughed and said that she wasn't at all afraid of the gentleman, but that nothing would induce her to stay a moment in this house alone, and certainly not after sunset. "What's the matter with it?" I asked. "Why it's haunted? Didn't you know? That's the reason why it was going so cheap. Nobody ever stuck it here." It had been like that as long as she could remember, but I could get nothing out of her about the origin of the rumor. Her friend emphatically confirmed everything she had said. As I was a guest, I naturally couldn't make further inquiries in the village. My host was skeptical, but he was willing to give the house a thorough look over. We found nothing remarkable until we came to the attic. There, between the two wings of the house, we discovered a dividing wall, and in it a comparatively new door. About half an inch thick was a heavy lock and two huge bolts that shut off our wing from the unoccupied part. The girls did not know of the existence of this door. It presented something of a puzzle because the two wings communicated with one another both on the ground floor and on the first floor. There were no rooms in the attic to be shut off, and no signs of use. The purpose of the door seemed inexplicable. The fifth weekend was so unbearable that I asked my host to give me another room. This is what had happened. It was a beautiful moonlight night with no wind. In the room there were rustlings, creakings, and hangings. From outside, blows rained on the walls. I had the feeling there was something near me and opened my eyes. There, beside me on the pillow, I saw the head of an old woman, and the right eye, wide open, glared at me. The left half of the face was missing below the eye. The sight of it was so sudden and unexpected that I leapt out of bed with one bound, lit the candle, and spent the rest of the night in an armchair. The next day I moved into the adjoining room, where I slept splendidly and was no longer disturbed during this or the following weekend. I told my host that I was convinced the house was haunted, but he dismissed this explanation with smiling skepticism. His attitude, understandable though it was, annoyed me somewhat, for I had to admit that my health had suffered. Under these experiences, I felt unnaturally fatigued, as I had never felt before. I therefore challenged Dr. X to try sleeping in the haunted room himself. He agreed to this, and gave me his word that he would send me an honest report of his observations. He would go to the house alone and spend the weekend there, as to give me a fair chance. Next morning I left. 10 days later, I had a letter from Dr. X. He had spent the weekend alone in the cottage. In the evening, it was very quiet, and he thought it was not absolutely necessary to go up to the first floor. The ghost, after all, could manifest itself anywhere in the house, if there was one. So he set up his camp bed in the conservatory, and as the cottage really was rather lonely, he took a loaded shotgun to bed with him. Everything was deathly still. He did not feel altogether at ease, but nevertheless, almost succeeded in falling asleep after a time. Suddenly, it seemed to him that he heard footsteps in the corridor. He immediately struck a light and flung open the door, but there was nothing to be seen. He went back grumpily to bed, thinking I had been a fool. But it was not long before he again heard footsteps. and to his discomfiture, he discovered that the door lacked a key. He rammed a chair against the door with its back under the lock and returned to bed. Soon afterwards, he again heard footsteps, which stopped just in front of the door. The chair creaked, as though somebody was pushing against the door from the outside. He then set up his bed in the garden, and there he slept very well. The next night, he again put his bed in the garden, but at 1 o'clock it started to rain, so he shoved the head of the bed under the eaves of the conservatory and covered the foot with a waterproof blanket. In this way he slept peacefully, but nothing in the world would induce him to sleep again in the conservatory. He had now given up the cottage. A little later I heard from Dr. X that the owner had the cottage pulled down since it was unsaleable and scared away all tenants. Unfortunately, I no longer have the original report, but its contents are stamped indelibly on my mind. It gave me considerable satisfaction after my colleague had laughed so loudly at my fear of ghosts. So that's the end of Jung's story about him in a haunted house. And so I actually got this from this article, and the article continues and says something about Jung's exteriorization phenomena. So he did not believe in ghosts as an explanation of the disturbances. He believed in a psychological explanation of the exteriorization phenomena of, different hypnagogic hallucinations and dramatized intuitions, exaggerated perceptions in a state of hypnoid, catalepsy, and other psychological phenomena. So, in this article it says Jung also conceded that his interpretation naturally does not pretend to explain all ghost phenomena. So I think that's interesting. So, and then if you want to read more, you can read Fanny Moser's book that I mentioned in the beginning of this video. So there you have it, guys. Leave any comments that you have about any ghost or hauntings or sightings that you've experienced, any weird thing, anything that's weird. I want to read it, put it in the comments. I have experienced some weird story before. I'll just guess I'll end on this. When I was younger, I was probably about 8 years old, maybe 7, something like that, around that age. I used to live just with my mum in this 3-bedroom house, and it was this old house, and it's teared down now. It's gone now. It used to have holes in the wall everywhere, and there used to be lizards used to run everywhere through the holes in the wall. It was pretty bad. But one night I went up to go to the toilet, and this is what I saw with my eyes as a child, So I went to go to the toilet. It was really late at night. My mom's asleep, everyone's asleep. It's really dark. And I have to walk through the kitchen to get to the toilet, because that's the way the house was designed. And I kid you not, what I saw was an old lady cooking on a stove. Those old, I don't know, bassinet, I don't know what they call them. Those old kind of uniforms where they wear an apron and some weird bobby type bassinet hat cap thing. She was wearing that and just cooking on the stove, and I freaked out and just went back to bed. I don't know what that was. Psychologically, I think it is interesting to look into the exteriorization of emotions, because I think that's a good explanation. But who knows about these things, man? So yeah, leave some weird comments, and it'll be interesting to read them. So thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Oh yeah, I'm drinking my friend's blood. It's good.